In 2009, the budget line for unidentified biological hazards inside the Department of Homeland Security increased by 17%, though no public program was named. Out of quiet appropriations and interagency memoranda came the life of something that officially does not exist: the Cryptid Intervention Task Force. It was not born out of folklore. It was born out of paperwork. Reports had accumulated for decades after action reviews from forest rangers, maritime incident logs from the Coast Guard, unexplained livestock losses cataloged by agricultural agencies. Most were dismissed as misidentification. A small fraction were not. Lesser known fact: one of the earliest internal triggers for consolidation was a 2003 audit that found 312 cross-agency wildlife anomaly reports had no assigned follow-up authority, a bureaucratic gap rather than a monster. The problem was not belief. The problem was jurisdiction. When something large moved across state lines, across federal land, across tribal territory, who owned the response? Law enforcement had procedures for terrorism, for pandemics, for oil spills. It did not have doctrine for the unclassified unknown. Lesser known fact: early drafts of the doctrine borrowed language from the National Incident Management System, repurposing wildfire command charts for biological anomalies, a design compromise that prioritized structure over clarity. The parents were not a single agency. They were a coalition of necessity. Department of the Interior field biologists who had seen carcasses too cleanly stripped. National Guard logistics officers who understood rapid deployment to rural areas. Intelligence analysts trained to treat rumor as data until disproven. Lesser known fact: the first interagency workshop, held at a training facility in Virginia in 2008, ran a tabletop exercise using a fabricated large unknown predator scenario and concluded response time would exceed 72 hours under existing authorities, a test result that was considered unacceptable. Politics shaped the early years. No elected official wanted to be associated with funding for monsters, so the line items hid under invasive species control, biosecurity enhancement, and interagency wildlife response modernization. Lesser known fact: to pass committee review, planners capped the initial personnel strength at 48 operators to avoid triggering a higher oversight threshold tied to units larger than 50, a production issue of bureaucracy rather than manufacturing. Early prototypes were not weapons. They were protocols. Who calls whom at 0200 hours when a sheriff in rural Montana reports something that leaves 6-foot strides in snow and lifts? Livestock fencing? The answer became a secure hotline routed through a federal fusion center. Lesser known fact: the hotline was tested with simulated calls once per quarter, and the first 3 drills failed because state-level dispatchers did not recognize the clearance codes, a crew training detail that delayed activation by an average of 11 minutes. Equipment followed doctrine. If you are asked to intervene in an environment where identification is uncertain, you build for versatility. Night vision, thermal imaging, tranquilizer systems scaled for megafauna, non-lethal acoustic deterrence, and, when necessary, lethal. Force platforms. Lesser known fact: early equipment lists excluded high-caliber rifles due to public optics concerns, but field advisors argued successfully for inclusion after a ballistic test showed standard issue 5.56 mm rounds underperformed against stick-hide analog targets. A countermeasure lesson learned before contact at birth is rarely clean. The first operational deployment came in 2010 to a stretch of forests in the Pacific Northwest. After repeated reports of missing hikers and unusual spoor, the task force arrived with maps and containment grids and found mostly misidentified bear. Sin, but not entirely. Lesser known fact: soil compaction analysis conducted on one trackway revealed pressure estimates exceeding 1,200 pounds per footfall. Though subsequent rain degraded the data beyond courtroom standards, A weather impact that erased certainty. Childhood is the phase of misunderstanding. Operators trained as soldiers had to learn patience of biologists. Biologists had to learn brevity of tactical communication. The culture clash was immediate. Lesser known fact. The first internal review cited terminology confusion in 14% of radio transcripts, where words like specimen and target carried different assumptions, prompting a command doctrine shift towards standardized vocabulary. Training realities were blunt. Most deployments would result in nothing extraordinary. The work was perimeter control, evidence collection, reassurance of frightened communities. The extraordinary, when it came, would be brief. Lesser known fact. During the first 2 years, 82% of activations concluded with identification of known wildlife, a test result that reinforced skepticism inside partner agencies. Small changes mattered. The addition of portable, environmental DNA kits allowed field teams to sample water and soil for genetic traces, cutting lab turnaround from weeks to days. Lesser known fact. The first generation of these kits had a false positive rate near 6% in mixed sample environments, a design compromise that required double-blind confirmation before public statements. Misunderstandings extended outward. Conspiracy forums latched on to the existence of specialized units. Freedom of Information Act requests multiplied. The task force responded with silence, citing operational security. Lesser known fact. An internal survey found 27% of operators reported family strain due to inability to explain deployments, a psychological effect rarely discussed in public. Growth came not with headlines but with standardization. Manuals thickened, checklists multiplied. A logistics chain formed, with pre-positioned caches of equipment in 4 regions to ensure arrival within 24 hours to most of the continental United States. Lesser known fact. Budget analysis in 2014 showed that airlift costs accounted for 38% of operational expenditure, a supply constraint that drove investment in regional partnerships to reduce flight hours. Standardization meant procurement contracts. Thermal imagers rated for extreme cold. Drones with 40-minute flight endurance. Mobile command trailers hardened against rough terrain. Lesser known fact. One early drone model failed in heavy rain during a deployment in Appalachia, shorting circuitry after 22 minutes of exposure, a weather impact that led to revised IP ratings in future purchases. The system around it matured. Memoranda of understanding with state wildlife agencies, joint exercises with National Guard units twice per year, integration with federal labs capable of rapid DNA sequencing. Lesser known fact. A 2016 joint exercise in Alaska revealed that satellite communications degraded by 30% during geomagnetic disturbance, a test result that prompted acquisition of redundant HF radio systems. Mass production in this context meant people. Recruitment favored individuals with dual competencies, former special operations personnel with degrees in biology, wildlife officers with advanced tactical training. The unit never exceeded 120 members nationwide. Lesser known fact. Attrition. Rates peaked at 18% in 2017 due to burnout from irregular hours and high travel demands. A medical and psychological effect that forced rotation policies. Spare parts were mundane but vital. Batteries for thermal scopes. Replacement rotors for drones. Tranquilizer compounds with specific shelf lives. Lesser known fact. One sedative compound commonly used for large ungulates required cold chain storage below 8 degrees Celsius and a refrigeration. Failure during transport in Texas rendered 12 vials unusable, a production issue of logistics rather than factory. Manuals evolved with experience. Early guidance emphasized containment and capture when feasible. Later revisions recognized that unknown variables sometimes required rapid neutralization to protect civilians. Lesser known fact. After action analysis from a 2018 desert. Deployment showed that hesitation of 14 seconds between identification and engagement allowed a target to breach a perimeter line, leading to a command doctrine shift that clarified engagement thresholds. Growth also meant scrutiny. Congressional staff requested briefings, inspectors asked for metrics, the task force produced numbers, response times, incident resolutions, cost per deployment. Lesser known fact, median time from activation to boots on ground decreased from 31 hours in 2011 to 18 hours in 2019, a test result used to justify continued funding. Then came its peak, not a public battle. A night in late autumn in a mountainous region of the Midwest, where livestock losses had escalated and 2 hikers had vanished within a 10-day span. Thermal signatures on drone feeds showed movement inconsistent with known fauna patterns. The team deployed in a 3-ring containment formation. Lesser known fact, wind speeds of 22 miles per hour that night distorted thermal readings by dispersing heat plumes, a terrain and weather impact that complicated identification. The defining scenario unfolded over 47 minutes. An operator spotted movement at 300 meters, silhouette against tree line. Tranquilizer was attempted first. The dart struck, immediate effect. The mass estimate exceeded prior assumptions. Lesser known fact, post-incident analysis determined the dosage was calculated for a 900-pound animal, while field assessment suggested mass closer to 1,300 pounds, a design compromise in dosing protocols based on limited data. When the perimeter buckled, lethal force was authorized, controlled bursts, crossfire avoided by strict angles of fire drilled for months. The figure dropped, silence followed. Lesser known fact, ballistic recovery from the site found 2 rounds that had deflected off dense bone before penetration, a countermeasure reminder that anatomy can defeat expectation. Why did it work there? Because of preparation. Because radios functioned. Because lines of sight were mapped during daylight reconnaissance. Because doctrine allowed decisive action. Lesser known fact, an infrared beacon placed earlier in the evening to mark a ravinage prevented a pursuit unit from descending into a 40-foot drop. A battlefield improvisation that likely prevented casualties. Peak effectiveness is not measured only by success, but by absence of collateral damage. No civilians harmed, no stray rounds beyond containment, evidence collected, cataloged, transported under Chenov custody protocols. Lesser known fact, forensic analysis later confirmed presence of genetic sequences not matching entries in national databases. Though contamination could not be entirely ruled out, a test result that remains classified in detail. Fear spread in the community before facts did. The task force coordinated with local officials to attribute the incident to a dangerous animal neutralized without elaboration. Calm returned. Lesser known fact, a follow-up survey conducted by county health officials recorded a 12% temporary increase in reported anxiety symptoms among residents during the 2 weeks of activity, a psychological effect tied to visible federal presence. The cost was not abstract. Operators trained for ambiguity lived with it. Sleep cycles disrupted, constant readiness. The mathematics of survival calculated in seconds and meters. Lesser known fact, wearable biometric monitors introduced in 2020 showed average heart rates of 148 beats per minute during high contact incidents, sustained for over 6 minutes. A medical data point used to refine stress inoculation training. Injury patterns were specific. Lacerations from dense brush during pursuit, hearing strain despite protection in close quarters. The rare but serious trauma when containment failed. Lesser known fact, internal medical reviews identified a higher than average incidence of tinnitus among operators, linked to repeated exposure to suppressed but still concussive gunfire, a medical effect prompting upgraded ear protection. Fatigue accumulated in quieter ways, relationships strained by secrecy, Moral weight of lethal decisions made in shadow. Lesser known fact. An anonymous counseling program saw participation from 41% of personnel within its first year. A crew support detail reflecting recognition of psychological toll. Survival math governed planning. If response time is 80 hours and incident escalation window is 12, preposition assets closer. If tranquilizer onset averages 5 minutes and target sprint speed is estimated at 25 miles per hour, perimeter radius must account for 3,600 feet of potential movement. Lesser known fact. Simulation software adopted in 2021 reduced planning time for containment grids by 22%. A production improvement in digital tools. Old age does not arrive with ceremony. It comes with new technology that changes the landscape. Advances in drone autonomy allowed wider surveillance without human risk. Genomic databases expanded, reducing unknowns. The number of incidents requiring direct intervention declined. Lesser known fact. From 2022 to 2024, activations dropped by approximately 35% compared to the prior 3-year average. A test result suggesting deterrence or improved early identification. New tactics emerged. Remote sensors seated in heliport areas transmitted real-time data. Public education campaigns about wildlife behavior reduced misidentification calls. Lesser known fact. A pilot program in 3 states cut false activations by 19%. After distributing standardized track identification guides, a command doctrine shift toward prevention. Better counters also evolved. If something adapts to avoid thermal detection by submerging in water, sensors adjust to monitor disturbance. Patterns. If rapports cluster in one terrain type, training shifts there. Lesser known fact. An analysis of 10 years of incident geography revealed 62% occurred within 5 miles of major water sources, a terrain impact that reshaped patrol emphasis. Changing doctrine reframed the mission. Instead of pure intervention, the task force increasingly functioned as coordinator and analyst, stepping in only when thresholds were crossed. Younger operators trained more in data interpretation than direct engagement. Lesser known fact. Training hours allocated to firearms proficiency decreased by 15% over 5 years, replaced by instruction in drone operation and bioinformatics. A design compromise reflecting new priorities. Replacement is gradual. As technology diffuses, regional agencies acquire similar capabilities, the unique niche narrows. The Cryptid Intervention Task Force becomes less a spear point and more a node in a network. Lesser known fact. By 2025, 28 states had formalized wildlife anomaly response units within their own departments, a production expansion that reduced federal primacy. Yet legacy persists. Later designs copied its integration of biology and tactics. Emergency management doctrine incorporated its containment models. Interagency trust improved through shared exercises. Lesser known fact. A 2023 academic study on interagency coordination cited the task force model as reducing average response friction scores by 0.8. On a 5-point scale, a test result of bureaucratic harmony rather than combat. Militaries learned something subtle. Not every threat fits traditional categories. Flexibility of structure matters. Training for ambiguity can be as important as training for certainty. Lesser known fact. A briefing at a Joint Chiefs Symposium referenced the task force when discussing gray zone threats, marking a command doctrine shift that acknowledged biological uncertainty as a strategic factor. It never sought recognition. Most citizens will never hear its name in an official capacity. That may be its measure of success. Lesser known fact. Internal metrics counted incidents resolved without public awareness as a positive outcome, totaling in the low hundreds over 15 years, a quiet statistic in classified annexes. In the end, it is not about monsters. It is about systems built to face the unknown with structure rather than panic. Institutions, like organisms, adapt or they fail. The Cryptid Intervention Task Force lived in that space between disbelief and danger, shaped by budgets, by terrain, by human nerves under strain. Lesser known fact, its founding charter expires automatically every 5 years, unless renewed. A built-in mortality that forces periodic justification. Every life has a lesson. This one suggests that preparedness for the improbable requires humility more than bravado, and that sometimes the most important battles are the ones the public never knows were fought. Renewal came in cycles of 5 years, each vote quieter than the last. The charter survived not because of spectacle, but because of spreadsheets inciting curves trending downward, response times compressing, cost per deployment stabilizing, within 3% variance year to year. Lesser known fact, during the 2025 renewal review, auditors noted that 71% of activations now ended at the assessment stage without field engagement, a test result interpreted as proof of maturation. Rather than irrelevance, age changes posture. In its early years, the task force moved like a reaction unit. In its later years, it moved like a diagnostic service. Data flowed in continuously, sensor arrays, wildlife migration models, climate anomaly forecasts, sand analysts filtered noise from signal before a single rotor spun. Lesser known fact, integration of NOAA severe weather feeds reduced unnecessary mobilizations during storm seasons by 14%, a weather impact adaptation that saved both money and fatigue. The center of gravity shifted from muscle to mind. Operators still trained with rifles and tranquilizers, but more hours were spent in simulation labs parsing probability trees. A generation that had joined for the field learned to respect the spreadsheet. Lesser known fact, average annual live fire training rounds per operator dropped from 2,400 in 2016 to 1,650 by 2024. A design compromise reflecting lower expected kinetic engagement. Technology aged differently. First generation thermal imagers became museum pieces within a decade, replaced by multispectral systems capable of distinguishing between warm-blooded mammals and environmental heat signatures, with 92% accuracy under optimal conditions. Lesser known fact, field validation trials in swamp environments showed accuracy dipping to 76% due to humidity interference, a test result that prevented overconfidence in marketing claims. Relationships deepened. Tribal authorities, once wary of federal intrusion, signed cooperative agreements recognizing cultural sensitivities around certain lands and stories. The task force learned to listen before it moved. Lesser known fact, a joint memorandum in 2022 formalized requirement of tribal liaison consultation before deployment on designated territories, a command doctrine shift that reduced community complaints to near zero in those regions. There were no parades. There were debrief rooms, photographs of forests, lakes, desert ridgelines, pinned to corkboards with timestamps and coordinates. Each image a reminder of nights spent scanning tree lines for motion. Lesser known fact, a review of archived drone footage from 2011-2013, using modern image recognition software, identified 11 instances of misclassified wildlife that had previously been marked unknown. A production improvement of retrospective analysis. The mythology outside the unit continued to grow. Podcasts speculated. Online forums stitched together sightings into grand narratives. Inside, the work remained procedural. Measure stride length, sample water, calculate risk radius. Lesser known fact, internal guidance discouraged use of the word cryptid in official reports, preferring unidentified biological entity, a terminology compromise designed to maintain scientific posture. Decline, if it can be called. That did not mean disappearance. It meant integration. Autonomous sensor networks, funded under broader environmental monitoring programs, now performed much of the early warning role. Artificial intelligence models flagged anomalies in livestock. Mortality patterns faster than any hotline call. Lesser known fact: a pilot AI anomaly detector in the Midwest reduced average detection lag from 9 days to 36 hours. A test result that shifted resources toward analysis teams. Younger personnel entered with different expectations. They had grown up in a world where drones were common and genetic sequencing was routine. The mystique that once surrounded deployments felt thinner. Lesser known fact: exit interviews conducted in 2024 indicated that 54% of departing members cited routine nature of mission as a reason for transition. A psychological evolution from adrenaline to administration. Still, there were moments: a winter in the Northeast where tracks appeared across frozen marshland, too wide set for known predators. A summer in the Southwest where ranchers reported coordinated livestock harassment beyond typical pack behavior. Each time, the task force responded with containment grids and calm voices on radios. Lesser known fact: in the Northeast case, ice thickness measured only 4 inches in sections, forcing operators to distribute weight in staggered formation. A terrain impact that shaped movement patterns. The cost never vanished. Even in years of fewer engagements, readiness required vigilance. Physical standards held steady. Mental resilience, training expanded. Lesser known fact: cognitive load assessments introduced in 2023 measured decision fatigue during prolonged surveillance, showing measurable decline in reaction time after 11 consecutive hours. A medical data point that enforced mandatory rotation. Schedules: replacement loomed, not as abolition, but absorption. Homeland security frameworks broadened to include climate-driven ecological disruption, invasive species migration, and zoonotic spillover events. The task force found itself nested within a larger biological resilience directorate. Lesser known fact: reorganization in 2026 consolidated 3 previously separate response units under one command, reducing administrative overhead by 12%. A production streamlining rather than dissolution. Legacy often hides in footnotes. The containment model pioneered for unknown biological threats informed later pandemic quarantine zoning, adapted to urban grids rather than forests. The language of layered perimeters moved from field manuals into public health documents. Lesser known fact: planners of a major metropolitan emergency exercise in 2025 credited rural containment simulations of the task force as conceptual inspiration, a command doctrine echo beyond its origin. What did militaries learn? That ambiguity demands interoperability, that data must travel faster than rumor, that specialized units should be small enough to remain agile but connected enough to scale. Lesser known fact: a defense white paper cited the task force as an example of micro-unit agility, recommending force packages under 150 personnel for niche threats. A structural lesson drawn from its cap size. What did civilians gain? Fewer nights of sirens in small towns, quiet resolution of incidents that might have spiraled into panic, a sense unspoken that someone watched a tree line when reports grew strange. Lesser known fact: county-level data in regions with repeated activations showed no statistically significant long-term property value decline, countering fears that federal presence would stigmatize communities. A socioeconomic test result: every organism, institutional or biological, faces entropy. Funding priorities shift, leaders retire, technology leaps ahead. The task force prepared for its own obsolescence by writing manuals detailed enough for others to inherit. Lesser known fact: an internal knowledge transfer project digitized 15 years of field notes into a searchable archive exceeding 2.3 million words. A production effort aimed at memory preservation. And quieter offices, veterans of the early deployments, sometimes describe the first nights the uncertainty, the raw edges of a unit still defining itself. They remembered missteps, corrected, Equipment failures, patched with duct tape and resolve. Lesser known fact, one early mobile command trailer logged 186,000 miles before decommissioning. Its suspension replaced 3 times due to rugged terrain. Where, a mechanical cost of growth, by its 15th year, the task force was less myth and more method. It had mapped the geography of rumor against the topology of evidence. It had learned that most shadows are ordinary and that a few are not. Lesser known fact. Cumulative data across its lifespan showed that fewer than 4% of activations resulted in classification as unresolved biological anomaly, a statistical anchor against sensationalism. And so it continues, not as a spear point alone, but as a template, a proof that institutions can be built for the improbable without surrendering to fantasy. Its life story is not a tale of monsters slain, but of procedures refined, of budgets defended, of humans trained to stand in cold forests and measure before they fire. Lesser known fact. As of the last renewal cycle, average tenure of active members stood at 6.8 years, a stability figure rare for high readiness units. In the end, the quiet moral is this: preparation for the unknown is an act of discipline, not imagination. Structures built in shadow can still serve daylight. And the measure of such a force is not how loudly it fights, but how rarely it must.